Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Welcome to the last session of the day. This is session 9A, Decriminalizing Drug Possession in Canada, Recent Developments. I'm Sarah Clark. I'm the Medify Knowledge Broker, and I'm very excited to be welcoming our two speakers for this presentation, Matthew Bonn and Sandra Calhoun-Chu. Matthew is the program coordinator with the Canadian Association of People Who Use Drugs. He's also a national board member with Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy, board member of the International Network of Health and Hepatitis and Substance Users, and a knowledge translator for the Dr. Peters Center. He is a current drug user and a formerly incarcerated person. Sandra is co-executive director of the HIV Legal Network, where she works on HIV-related human rights issues concerning prisons, drug policy, sex work, women, and immigration, and has helped guide the organization's litigation in key court cases in Canada and internationally. Sandra was called to the bar of British Columbia in 2003. A reminder to everyone, you all know this by now, I'm sure, but please pop any questions that you have into the chat. I'll be keeping track and we'll relay them to the speakers at the end of the presentation. And with that, I will turn it over to Matthew and Sandra. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Sarah, so much for having us and for the lovely introduction. And just like to acknowledge that I am presenting today from the unceded and ancestral land of the Mi'kmaq. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, which the Mi'kmaq and the Maliseet people first signed with the British Crown in 1725. The treaties did not deal with the surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized the Mi'kmaq and the Maliseet title and established the rules what was forever to be an ongoing relationship between nations. And I'll pass it over to Sandra.
Thanks, Matt, and thank you, Sarah, for inviting us to give this talk. I am here in Toronto, which is Treaty 13 territory, and it's the traditional home of the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And I feel really privileged to be able to present to you from this territory today. We're going to go through a few different things today. The first thing we wanted to share with you is a short video called Decriminalize Now, a Kia story. After the video, we will have a presentation with PowerPoint slides, and then we'll have a Q&A, and then we'll wrap up with a really important 1 minute of silence. So without further ado, I want to present to you this video, Decriminalize Now.
Hey, my name is Akia Munga. I go by Akia. I identify as agender, so I use they, them pronouns, and my name works for me. I'm also a harm reduction human. A harm redux human, if you would. I'm also an advocate to ending the opioid emergency, and I am a big-time Blacktivist. So Blacktivist with a capital B. I was really small. There was some abuse and some really traumatic things that happened, and I was taking antidepressants. And then I was on this Paxil-Ritalin combination, which if you Googled that combination, there was a lot of suicides. And I started taking doubles and triples because it made me feel good. And I didn't feel bored. I didn't feel like I wasn't depressed. I had energy. And it felt good. I felt like a person. I'm actually currently non-using right now. I used to do a lot of fentanyl. I used to shoot a lot of fentanyl. And I'm currently on the Safe Supply program. And I say that harm reduction and Safe Supply, they saved my life twice. So when overdoses happen on site, there's this mandate that you call, the emergency. You call 911. Oftentimes when 911 is called, cops come as well. This one time that someone I think they had overdosed in the bathroom, the EMS was called, and along with the EMS came the police. But we understood that the cops were going to come through, and when cops come through, everything goes wrong. When cops come through, the probability that that substance user, that person of color will make it out alive is a lot slimmer. They'd come through to the front door and they were going to come in, and it was me, myself, and my supervisor, and we're like, no, sorry, you can't come in. and we ended up blocking the door. So we put ourselves in the frame of the door. So we said, if you want to speak to them, you can speak to us, but we're fine. Like, we have this under control. Like, things are okay. The police say what they always say, which is, well, we're just trying to do our job and we're here because we want to make sure that people are safe. But they're not. They're not there to make sure that people are safe. If Craig had known that the police were going to be called, Craig would have fled. Craig would not have been there. Craig could have overdosed in another place because he would have lost trust in us. A lot of folks who use, myself included, or who are street involved or have histories of homelessness or displacement, have really, really horrid, soured relationships with law enforcement. Law enforcement makes it their job to harass vulnerable and marginalized communities and make life a lot harder to live. If we weren't there to bar the door, who's to say that Craig would have been safe? And the fact that that is a question is a big problem. People who use drugs are demonized and criminalized for just living their lives, for just wanting to feel good and use the same amount of oxygen as everybody else. My utopia looks like no stigma, no shame, no judgment, no lives that are criminalized.
I want to thank Akia so much for sharing their story with us. So, as Akia talked about, the decriminalization does great harm to people who use drugs, and that is one of the key focuses of this presentation. So, before we begin, I wanted just to read out the disclosure of financial support. You can see the key points here. We declare no potential for conflict of interest. And today's learning objectives are, as Akia said, learning more about the harms and costs of criminalizing drug possession and drug prohibition more broadly, becoming familiar with some of the recent legal and political developments related to decriminalization in Canada, and there have been a lot over the last 24 months, and understand and know the rationale behind a civil society-led model of decriminalization that Matt will talk about near the second half of the presentation, one that promotes the human rights of people who use drugs. So just to give you a quick overview of the legal landscape, in Canada, drugs are scheduled, as you all know, and they're criminalized under a federal law called the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. The key provision that we're going to focus on today is Section 4. I mean, the whole act criminalizes different facets of drug possession, selling, sharing, production, but this section is the one that criminalizes possession for personal use, Section 4, and the punishments range from a fine to up to 7 years of prison time. So we see it's a really harmful provision because for that section alone, this is Section 4 alone, almost 500,000 people have been arrested in Canada between 2014 and 2018. The number's obviously higher now with the additional 2 years of data, but the majority of them were for personal possession. So we know that this is a big harm for people who use drugs, and it's disproportionately borne by Black and Indigenous people. So here are some statistics. This shouldn't be anything new to anybody in the audience, I'm sure, but these are some of the statistics that mostly are sought through access to information requests. It's not something that the police obviously share freely. You have to file an ATI and wait sometimes a year or longer to get this information, but you see in Toronto, for instance, where I am, Black people with no criminal convictions are 3 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis possession. And this is pre-legalization of cannabis than white people with similar backgrounds. I just filed an access to information request for data for the last 5 years beyond the cannabis legalization, and the numbers are still the same. Black people still bear the disproportionate burden of drug arrests for simple possession. In Vancouver, the same story. Black and Indigenous people are dramatically overrepresented in drug charges. And this is the same story again and again across Canada with different news reports. And it's not just arrests. We know that in jail, in the federal prison system, 20% of Black federal prisoners are there for a drug offense. And in particular, Black women are in federal prison serving a sentence for drug offense. 54% of Black women in federal prison are serving time there for a drug offense. And Indigenous and Black women are more likely than white women to be in prison for that reason. What are the costs of enforcing criminal drug laws? So this is not isolated to simple drug possession, but for drug prohibition large, it's 6.4 billion was the number that the Canadian Institute for Substance Use and Research and the CCSA came up with in 2017. That includes the costs associated with enforcement of drug laws and other impacts. So imagine if all that money was redirected towards community supports, which is part of the civil society platform. And so now I'm going to move into some developments. One of the key developments that happened just last summer was a report from the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police. It came out in July 2020, and they, quote, said there's a compelling case for transformative change. They agreed, these are the police, law enforcement, for the first time saying, as a whole, decriminalization is effective way to reduce public health and public safety harms. They endorsed alternatives to criminal sanctions, but they did say in a decriminalized regime that there should be, instead of criminal conviction, there should be a fine or another type of sanction. So it's not removing all penalties. They said criminal penalties are still applicable to illegal drug manufacturers, dealers, and traffickers, and police should still play a key role in diverting people to treatment and other social services. So there's, in their report, they felt police still had a role to play. And here is just a snapshot of police across Canada who've endorsed this and said, you know, decriminalization, we endorse this version of decriminalization at least, which means some kind of sanction, some kind of fine, some kind of police involvement into diversion. And as I'm sure you all know, a lot of health authorities across Canada have also endorsed decriminalization from coast to coast, including our Chief Public Health Officer, Dr. Theresa Tam. She didn't endorse it, but she said we should move towards a societal discussion on decriminalization. This was 1 year ago. Another pretty profound change was a directive that was sent out to the Public Prosecution Service of Canada. So these are the lawyers who work for the government who are responsible for prosecuting drug offenses. They do this across so this directive applies across Canada except Quebec and New Brunswick. So almost national. So this directive said they should only focus on prosecuting the most serious cases of simple possession that raise public safety concerns. Otherwise, they should pursue suitable alternative measures and diversion. And in this directive, the prosecutors, the PPSC directive said that criminal sanctions have limited effectiveness and they're actually harmful effects of criminal records and short periods of incarceration. What do they describe as the most serious manifestations of crime? They said anything that poses risk to safety or well-being of children, risk safe health or safety to others, risk community efforts to address consumption of controlled substances, if it happens in a jail or penitentiary, or if it's committed by a peace officer or public officer. So this is how they define the most serious manifestations of harm. And while this was a promising development, I think there's also questions about who this will impact, people who have children, whether they would necessarily be prosecuted, even if they don't necessarily pose a risk of harm to children, or people who are incarcerated, for instance. So there have also been a number of private members' bills in the last 2 years that sought to decriminalize to varying degrees drug possession. So the Liberals introduced a private members' bill. Is Nathaniel Erskine-Smith, a member of Parliament in Toronto Beaches. He introduced 2 bills. One, which was like a full repeal of Section 4, which was a section I just mentioned, that just take it out of the CDSA. And then another bill that was like evidence-based diversion, where police officers, when they do approach somebody and they do possess drugs for personal use, they could have 3 options. They could either do nothing, they could issue a warning, or they could refer someone voluntarily to a community service provider. The NDP also introduced a bill, Bill C-286. That's Member of Parliament Don Davies, who's out in Vancouver. He just got reelected. Actually, Nathaniel Erskine-Smith also got reelected. And his bill was to repeal Section 4 also and to expunge. So he went it further. He said expunge all convictions for everybody who had a conviction for simple possession. And there was also a Senate bill from a senator who was a former police officer, Senator Boniface, S-229. And her bill was that the Minister of Health must develop a national strategy for decriminalizing substances, illegal substances, and also repeal Section 4 of the CDSA. So you can see in the span of less than 2 years, a spate of bills that are moving in the direction that we think they should move. And finally, there was a government bill that died on the order paper when election was called, Bill C-22. This was specifically introduced by then Justice Minister Lametti to address the over-incarceration of Indigenous peoples as well as Black and marginalized Canadians. And what that bill would do is completely repeal all the mandatory minimum penalties for drug offenses. So currently, most of the drug offenses have like a minimum prison sentence that came in during the Harper years under the Conservative government about 10 years ago. So this bill would have removed them. And they would also, like Nathaniel Erskine-Smith's bill, the diversion bill, have an option for officers to consider. They don't have to do this, but they can consider other measures other than arresting them to deal with individuals who are in alleged possession of drugs. So the three options, again, are sort of reflecting the earlier bill. Take no further action, issue a warning, or refer the individual to a program, agency, or other service provider in the community that may assist the individual. And so I think it's important. The Bill C-22, it died on the order paper, but it did recognize that criminal sanctions imposed in respect of the possession of drugs for personal use can increase the stigma associated with drug use and are not consistent with established public health evidence. So I think that was a huge concession on the part of the federal government, who up to now has never, I know the Prime Minister Trudeau had never agreed that decriminalizing drug possession was the way to go. And there's also been local requests for exemptions. So what this is cities can ask the health minister to exempt the entire city within their city boundaries from any portion of the drug law. So this happened in Vancouver in November. The Vancouver City Council voted to make this request to the federal health minister, and they submitted a proposal to exempt the entire city of Vancouver in May 2021. That's still happening. It's in development, and we'll see what happens now with the same government being reelected. The entire province of BC is also considering this. So imagine like if the entire province of BC was to take the lead. Also, they're considering a Section 56 exemption request. And the City of Toronto has convened a working group to develop an exemption request. So you see like pockets of this happening across the country. And there's a number of other cities that beyond this that have endorsed decriminalization, although they haven't taken the formal steps to ask for one. So what has been the impact of some of these developments over the last little while? So I don't know if any of you saw the CBC article that came out about a few weeks ago. In Ontario, 85% of drug possession charges have been dropped in the last 12 months. And in this article, they interviewed a prosecutor who attributed it to the directive that I just mentioned, the one that said only for the most serious manifestations of drug possession would we keep prosecuting people. So that is pretty unprecedented, as the headline says. And so I wanted to just to maybe conclude with how we would get there if we were to decriminalize in Canada. So I mentioned the local exemptions. That's the last bullet point on the slide. You can make an exemption, like a city or a province could say, I want a Section 56 exemption from the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. And that's sort of how supervised consumption services work. They're like mini pockets of decriminalization where people and the service provider and people who are there get exempted from the CDSA to provide this very essential service. The health minister could issue a nationwide Section 56 exemption, say the entire country is exempted from Section 4 of the CDSA in the public interest. There is partial decriminalization now, you could argue, with the PPSC directive. And some cities and states in the context of COVID last year actually said, moratoria, we're not going to enforce drug laws. And you saw like a dramatic decline in people being arrested because the state prosecutors or the state attorneys said, we're just not going to stop. It's not a priority for us to do this. So that could happen. That's called de facto decriminalization. So you're not actually repealing the law, but in effect, some people are benefiting from decriminalization. Then there's de jure decriminalization, which is actually a change to the law. So here's a few samples of countries across the world that have said, their courts have said, look, criminalizing people for drug possession is unconstitutional. It's a human rights violation. They should not be subject to state sanctions. So these countries, Mexico, Chile, Spain, Colombia, and Argentina. The last time it was considered in Canada was in Malmo Levine. This is 18 years ago now, 2003. And so at the time, it was considering the decriminalization of marijuana. But I thought this was an interesting quote that I pulled from the case. They said, the Supreme Court said in that time, advancing the protection of vulnerable individuals through criminalization is a policy choice that falls within the broad legislative scope conferred on Parliament. But equally, it is open to Parliament to decriminalize or otherwise modify any aspect of the marijuana laws that it no longer considers to be a good public policy. So I think that sets us up nicely for Matt's presentation. Oh, sorry, for one final thing is they can decriminalize through a federal bill. So if Justice Lametti or the new Justice Minister said this was not working, we need to decriminalize, they could introduce a bill and just repeal Section 4. But I'm going to hand it over to Matt to talk about court case.
Yeah, thank you, Sandra. And, just listening to all those statistics, and, it really shows who's primarily impacted by the criminalization of drugs. And, we see this with the overdose crisis, and Black, Indigenous people are more impacted, and they die from overdoses higher than Caucasian people. But CAPUD is actually more on the de jure decriminalization spectrum. We feel like exemptions, they're costly. They're a lot of work. You have to renew them every year or every few years. So we actually received a court challenges program grant to pursue decriminalization. And my colleague, my boss, the executive director of CAPUD, Natasha Tusnard, our legal counsel, Dustin Klott, and myself actually got to go to Vancouver on August 31st, Overdose Awareness Day, and to file our case against the Supreme Court, against the Attorney General of Canada. And we have 4 co-plaintiffs that are all a part of the constitutional challenge. We have 3 people who use drugs and a mother who lost 2 children. So this is very new. This is a novel approach. We really want to strike out sections of the CDSA. So as you've seen, really kind of as you've seen kind of in the bills that were put forth by the politicians, there's a lot around Section 4 of the CDSA, which is around possession. So moving to our civil society platform, which Sandra has been really leading with my boss as well, Natasha, and a larger group of civil society organizations. This is how we would really envision decriminalization in Canada. So the proposed drug policy includes fully decriminalizing all drug possession for personal use, as well as sharing or selling of limited quantities. So that's a full repeal of Section 4. But also, we're also looking at striking out certain amendments of Section 5, which really focuses on the criminalization of trafficking for the possession of purpose of trafficking. Really what CAPUD believes that anything under importing or exporting or manufacturing of drugs should be allowed. And really that's how drug use culture is really cultivated. We say, don't use alone, make sure you carry naloxone. It just happens naturally that people split and share and sell drugs to one another. So if we were just to strike out Section 4 and possession of drugs, then there's a chance that there could be a large portion of focus putting into just like people who are mainly criminalized that are running for people who buy drugs, right? Maybe they pool all their money together, give it to one person, they go get it, they bring it back. And these are the people that we see that end up in jail or provincial or federal institutions for a long time. And actually, a really interesting development in splitting and sharing around drugs, which splitting and sharing could be, it is a form of trafficking. We formed a working group through the Dr. Peter A's Foundation to look at splitting and sharing within supervised consumption sites because we've seen it as a huge barrier. So previously to August of this year, you weren't allowed to split or share within supervised consumption sites or overdose prevention sites. We got a group of people together. We did a survey. We talked to people who use drugs. We talked to overdose prevention sites and supervised consumption site workers. And really, we put that into action and we created a protocol. And Health Canada reached out and said, we're really interested in allowing this to happen within supervised consumption sites. So now, if you go to a subsection 56.1 exemption to open a supervised consumption site, you are allowed to split and share under certain amendments that Health Canada has. So there's one that says both people that are splitting and sharing must be consuming drugs during that visit. That's something that we wouldn't agree on, but at least this is one form of trafficking that is now allowed within kind of pockets, as Sandra mentioned, as supervised consumption sites if they wanted to apply for it. So we also agree in our civil society platform that we'd like to see the removal of all sanctions and interventions associated with simple drug possessions or the sharing or splitting of limited quantity. So this isn't exactly what you've seen with the Canadian Association of Chiefs Police platform, but we would like to see like everything removed. So any kind of administrative penalties, health assessments, the confiscation of substances, paraphernalia, or medical supplies. If a law enforcement agency takes someone's drugs, then they may have to be forced back into the survival sex trade or survival sex industry, or to go and buy and sell drugs again. And it really puts them at harm for criminalization and the harms that may come with that. Drug treatment courts as a coercive alternative to criminal sanction, we don't agree with them. They are kind of very, just from my personal experience, I wasn't even eligible for drug treatment courts, and I had like 3 possession charges of fentanyl. And when I did actually end up in jail, I seen multiple people that went to drug treatment courts. They, broke the littlest thing. They missed a meeting, they didn't go to a court date, they didn't get a job, and then they actually end up doing more time in jail. So we'd like to see that removed as well, and any kind of coerced or involuntary treatment or other health interventions. So another key feature of our civil society platform is the automatic expungement of previous convictions for simple drug possession and for necessity trafficking. As we know with cannabis, this didn't happen overnight. There's still a lot of people that have cannabis charges, and that really limits them for employment, for travel, to really do any kind of, really just to kind of clear up their past, right? When people spend time in jail, it should be spent, and they should not have to kind of carry around this really this second-class citizen when you are labeled a criminal or you have a criminal record. There's so many limitations. So we would like to see an automatic expungement, not people having to pay extraordinary dollars to go through that process, which may take 2 to 3 years, and it's not guaranteed. We'd just like to see it completely expunged. And with that, it should include any kind of breaches, bail, probation, or parole conditions associated with those charges. Finally, we think there should be clear rules and strict limitations relating to when police can stop, search, and investigate a person for drug possession. And really, I believe this should only be around, really drug importing, exporting, and manufacturing. It should be around, people consume drugs. We know that, we work in this field, and When police enforcement become the gatekeepers, there's a lot of stigma and discrimination and just criminalization that happens towards people who use drugs. We'd like to see this be replaced by people with the knowledge, the expertise, the skills, and trained workers with lived expertise of drug use, and frontline workers to really be the first responders if there is, any kind of involvement around a drug-related charge. And additionally, so there's the another key feature is redistributing resources, and this is a big topic around defunding the police, and I think people have been saying redistributing resources for a long time, but the conversation didn't really hit mainstream and everyday conversations within people until people said defund the police. And we're not saying defund the police, but we are saying that we need to reallocate funds to include health, education, housing, and social services that support people who use drugs and promote the safety and well-being of those communities. In no way are we saying abolish the police. There, in any kind of society, there has to be some sort of law enforcement, but with the extreme police budgets that they have, it just kind of gives an extra, it allows them to focus so much time, energy, and resources on people who use drugs and criminalize them, and by criminalizing them. So back to our CAPUD litigation, and I will put our webpage in the chat box along with our GoFundMe. So we did receive a court challenges program to start the case, but this is going to be another insight case. It's not going to happen overnight. This could be, years and years before we see any kind of effective change from it. So we really need all the support we can get. So we have a GoFundMe that is up and running. On our webpage, you can see the plaintiffs, you can see the notice of civil claim, and you can see pretty much all the information that you really need to around the case. And that's it for me, and I think we're gonna take questions from there.
So the first question is about the trafficking laws. So would changing or repealing the trafficking laws also help make drug checking easier for community groups? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think if you make around kind of removing certain sanctions of Section 5 of the CDSA, so by splitting and sharing or just passing drugs to one another, you are essentially trafficking drugs. So of course it would help by checking drugs. I think we really need a lot of funding and resources to go into more comprehensive drug checking. Right now, drug testing strips or for fentanyl and benzo just aren't cutting it. And we only have so many mass spectrometers that can really get all the novel psychoactive substances that we are seeing in the drug supply. Well, a lot of the fentanyl is cut with novel benzos, novel non-medicalized benzos, so flurazepam, etolazam, things that aren't meant to be consumed medically. So yeah, from my perspective, it would certainly help.
I hadn't just a comment about the point about trafficking, that splitting and sharing within supervised consumption sites would be a form of trafficking. That hadn't occurred to me, and I'm thinking about it like, oh, of course it would be, and that's it's just an interesting thing for me to reflect on, that is illegal, that is that's a criminal offense currently. Another question, would these proposed changes allow compassion clubs so people can purchase what they want, including, substances currently deemed illicit?
I can take this question, if that's okay. So yes, they would, because I think the original framing, the actual platform evolved And I actually noticed a little typo in the platform where I forgot to fix. We had originally the thinking was around to distinguish trafficking and possession for personal use was limited quantities. And there was feedback that we wanted to be able to permit compassion clubs to operate. So the language has sort of changed slightly to say to provide safe supply, which would include compassion clubs to support one's own substance use or for subsistence. So those three provisions that are actually in the CAPUD court challenge would cover compassion clubs, hopefully, because they are a form of safe supply.
And just to follow up on that, Sandra, I think, the Drug User Liberation Front is a great example of that. And they were one of maybe our biggest critics around limited quantities and threshold quantities on our civil society platform, because essentially, they want to be able to provide a safe supply of cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine for as many people as they have. And, on Overdose Awareness Day, I was able to receive a safe supply of heroin. They gave out at least 200 doses of safe supply of all those drugs, and they're doing that because there are no threshold quantities, or they don't believe in threshold quantities, and they actually applied with the subsection 56.1 exemption to allow them to do this illegally. They don't have I put the link in the chat, which has their exemption request. I don't think they have an answer yet, but they've done this on 4 or 5 occasions where they have purchased drugs from the dark web using cryptocurrency. They test the substances, they weigh them out, they package them in a way that says, this is cocaine, 100% pure cocaine, this is heroin, 40% heroin, 60% cut, whatever. I think they were, I forget what they were using for buff, but and the same with methamphetamine. So it really gives a model of not only compassion clubs, but maybe a way to one day regulate and legalize drugs.
Mm-hmm. If I can just maybe elaborate on what a threshold is. When we're referring to thresholds, it's to distinguish between, like I said, simple possession and trafficking. And one of the reasons it was seemed attractive at the outset was to limit the discretion of law enforcement. So if you have a number where like you just can't touch that person, then things like racial profiling, which we saw in that one of the slides you see, and the disproportionate harms that are directed towards certain people who use drugs, not everyone who uses drugs, would hopefully be, that discretion would be limited. But we did see eventually like the pitfalls of having thresholds, because it would prevent compassion clubs from operating.
And Sandra, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think one of those pitfalls around the threshold quantities was the BCCSU was tasked with actually giving out threshold quantities, and they did so, and they gave out like way larger amounts than what Vancouver finally kind of put forward. And what was, they actually asked law enforcement what they thought threshold quantities should be. So we were trying to do it in a way that, this will maybe get law enforcement out of it. But how it worked out, it was like, okay, we're going to ask law enforcement what they think threshold quantities should be, which if they're not using drugs, they're not buying and splitting and sharing drugs on a daily basis, they're just confiscating drugs. They really don't know what people are consuming and how much they're consuming. And really, to have thresholds with an unregulated market, you have no idea what you are consuming or buying at any given time. So it really doesn't make any sense to have thresholds unless we are going to legalize and regulate all substances.
Yeah. So Matt's referring to the Vancouver exemption request, where they actually developed thresholds. And in part of their submission to Minister of Health, they said, here, Health Canada, here's our request for an exemption. They delineated some thresholds that were very, very low. And I know that there was even a rapid scan that was done after, and they said it's not consistent with how people are using right now. And it's going to actually cause people to get arrested for drug possession, even if they're just using for personal use, because the thresholds are so low. So that is for sure one of the pitfalls.
Some more questions, some more great questions have come up. One question is about the question around how does one respond to the fears of for like drug, if someone thinks drug possession charges help to keep children safe, how do you respond to those concerns? Because I think that's a really, a real and valid concern.
And I'll jump in quickly, Sandra, before you. And I really love Nazali's perspective on this because, she has gone to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime and the Commission of Narcotics and Drugs. And they're like, well, who are we talking about when we're talking about keeping youth safe, right? Do we have youth at the table? And I know for myself, I started experimenting with drugs when I was a youth, right? So it's like, I think by having, safe supply of drugs, by having these, by decriminalizing drugs, you have more of an effective line of communication to talk about harm reduction methods, to talk about naloxone, to talk about safe supply and safe using consumption practices, because youth, when drugs are decriminalized, are a lot of times at risk for, when drugs are criminalized, sorry, are a lot of times are the ones most at risk for contracting HIV or hepatitis C or other drug related harms. So I think, we really need to change the way that we look at things. And by decriminalizing drugs, we can have an open and honest communication with our children about drug use. And maybe they'll reach out and talk to us before they go and consume drugs.
I think a key resource I would direct people to is Mom Stop the Harm. And they have done phenomenal work. And they are people who felt very acutely and profoundly and intimately the loss of a child because of drug criminalization and the lack of safe supply. And I think they have tons of resources on their website that describe why criminalization did not keep their children safe.
Thank you for mentioning that resource. That's a great one for people to know about. And I'm sort of thinking there's something that leads into the next question. That's something that came to my mind. Like I'm thinking about, when I was a youth, when I was a child and a teenager and a young person, what did I have most access to? And it was alcohol. Like it was, and I think that your point about having the conversations with young people and bringing them to the table, I think that's a really important point. And I mentioned that just because there was a really great question to my mind in the chat. The legal drugs of alcohol and tobacco cause a lot of costs in terms of health problems and mortality, more than the opioid poisoning crisis. So this is a legalization and regulation question. What is the future vision for a decriminalized system?
I can take a stab at it. Those are conversations people are having. What do it look like in a regulated system? I think certainly the opioid poisoning crisis is not working. The current toxic drug supply, the status quo is not working. And I think, I've seen conversations about regulation according to the level of potential harm associated with each substance. And so it could be like pharmaceutical regulation, or it could be like the way we regulate cannabis. But those conversations are starting to happen. And I know a lot of drug users have been having them for a long time, but we haven't had the opportunity to really have those conversations because drugs are all still criminalized. But I think the future is like a safe, regulated supply that people don't have to risk arrest or stigma to access. I think that would be sort of in very broad strokes.
And I think, we have a really great opportunity in Canada with some of our other harm reduction approaches and progressive drug policy to really have this great model of decriminalization. You see, the Portuguese model or the Portugal model, which is kind of like the main model, but they still get arrested and brought into, law enforcement is still that very first kind of contact, right? Which it provides a lot of harm for people, right? So I think, if we're looking at, the harms of tobacco and alcohol, right? Like, that's around marketing. That's around, having alcohol is safe because it's legal, but, it's not safe when you drink a 40 ouncer when you're 14 years old, because that's what you kind of see in the media and it's glamorized. And I think with opioids and whatnot, and you hear this a lot, like, oh, and just because there's going to be a heroin assisted treatment program down the street doesn't mean I'm just going to wake up one day and go and use heroin. Like, that's not how drug use works, right? And only a very small amount of people who use drugs actually become dependent or addicted to drugs. So I think we really have to kind of, um, you know, a lot of society uses alcohol, tobacco, caffeine. These are all substances that, our economy evolves around. But when we look at the unregulated and illegal economy, um, there's so many harms there that could be addressed by just having a regulated supply, and that's what we really have to be moving towards.
I think it's, and please correct me if I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but I think it's important that there is acknowledgement that substances that substance use can be harmful, that people can develop a use disorder, that people are at higher risk of trauma, like all the things that we know and are told about, like the Canadian lower risk drinking guidelines and the lower risk cannabis use. These are rules around legal drugs because they are drugs that have potential to cause harm. And as Lisa pointed out in the chat, like alcohol and tobacco just cause enormous amounts of harm in a variety of ways. And the legalization doesn't solve all of those problems. It solves a very particular, or it addresses rather a particular subset of those problems. Is that fair? Is that a fair thing to say? Yeah. Okay. Well, that's good. Another question is: do you think there should be a total abolishment of trafficking charges? I think there is a clear distinction between someone buying drugs to split from a harm reduction perspective and someone buying wholesale for resale. So do you have any nuances around trafficking?
From my perspective, I would say yes. I would say, we should be looking at more importing, exporting, manufacturing, um, and, distribution level charges as kind of those most serious cases, right? Those are the ones where people are importing massive amounts of fentanyl, or even just, 20 or 25 grams of fentanyl to distribute into to press pills with. They have a pill manufacturer with that as well, right? Like, these things are not related to someone buying and splitting and sharing drugs. And I think there is a clear distinction. But I think how the CDSA is set up right now, it doesn't make it that clear.
A clarification has come in. So the question about harms, how to ensure that children are kept safe. The person wasn't they were referring more to like accidental use of high dose opioids by younger children who maybe don't know what they're taking or whatever. So any comments about those concerns, which are also real concerns that people have?
And, I think we've seen a lot of this around cannabis edibles, right? Really marketed cannabis gummies, cannabis chocolate bars, like those could really look at a way that's marketed towards kids, right? So I think they have to be clearly kind of regulated. They have to have a package that's, that's clearly says what's in it. But, these are chances that may happen with all drugs, regardless if they are legalized or not. But if they are legalized and regulated, we can start to kind of like put them with the stuff that's not supposed to be there. We don't have to hide them where maybe somebody may find them and see this thing that looks attractive to them, and they take it. And it just kind of creates a more general society to talk about these things in an open way.
Maybe just one quick point. Like I mentioned, the 6.4 billion that is spent on policing drug prohibition right now, and I think imagine if those resources were spent on education. I know that I think there's some comments in the chat about how it's really difficult, but if there were resources to do that, and imagine the harm reduction education, the safety education that could really hopefully prevent something like that from happening. Yeah, I think that's a really important piece of the civil society platform, the importance of redistributing the resources that could be saved.
A comment has just, a question. What are your comments to those who have benefited from drug treatment court and have got their life back from it?
My answer would be I haven't heard of anybody, and I know of a lot of people that it has really negatively impacted their life. Not saying that, you know, it does not work for certain people, but I would say a large majority of the people that it really kind of, people end up spending a lot of time in provincial jail, which, you know, they don't have access to as many employment resources, educational resources, the food isn't as good, they don't have as much free time, things like that, because they are under this weird like subsection of this drug treatment court law. And it's not available to everybody, you know, it's really only available to certain people. So it's like, yeah, you know, I think, I'm not saying it doesn't work for some people, but I'm saying I do know people that it hasn't worked for.
And maybe I could just jump in, like, imagine if those options of treatment and support and housing were voluntarily available. Like, you did not have the coercive arm of the state saying that if you fail your urine test, you're back you're back in jail. I have no doubt that access to housing and all those things actually are supportive, that are supportive of people, are helpful, but they should be available irrespective of whether you have a drug possession charge hanging over you.
Yeah, some comments coming in the chat about this. I don't know if you want to respond to the discussion coming out here. I mean, I think the idea is, I mean, different things work for different people. I mean, I don't need to be trying to, you know, smooth things over here, but different things work for different people. And I think, to your point, what if those things were available without the need for criminalization, without the need? And I think that's a very good question. Like, what would that look like? The point to the accountability that makes the difference. So the accountability of the court involvement, I suppose, being an important thing in building accountability is another point.
I just know from my story, I remember like I was denied drug treatment courts, and then when I was to be released, they wanted to put me on drug treatment court and monitor me for the next 2 years. So I had like 4 months left on my conditional sentence. So regardless if I got in trouble in those 4 months, I was done in 4 months. But they wanted to put me onto a drug treatment court for the next 2 years. So I had to go to court once a week. I had to do urines. I had to do all these things that could eventually lead me back into jail. And I just said, no, like, you wouldn't give it to me when I actually was thinking about it. But now afterwards, when I'm just about done my sentence, you want to put me on like an extra 2-year drug treatment court system. And, you know, I think different from province to province, they're different. From judge to judge, they're different. It really depends on the situation and the context of the case and the person and who's involved.
Well, I'm just wanting to be mindful of the time here. Oh, that's a good question, but a big question. Are we politically there yet? Can you address that in 30 seconds or less?
I mean, I think we're closer than we've ever been. Like, you saw there's 3 bills that were introduced and a government bill that wasn't quite the version of decriminalization that I think civil society, the platform, wants to see, but it's a vision that's getting us closer. And I think we need to hold our politicians' feet to the fire and keep the pressure on. We're in the midst of a drug poisoning crisis, and so this needs to be done sooner rather than later. And I mean, the court case is good to put the pressure on, but if they could just introduce a bill, I think all of you out there, if you could support CAPUD and also support any bill that comes out, we can get there in our lifetime.
I think there's a lot of really rich discussions that could be had amongst this group of people. And I'm sorry to cut it off here, but I know that there will be a minute of silence. And before we do that, I just want to thank everyone. Thank you to Matthew and Sandra. A huge thank you, and thank you to everyone who's here today. There's a session evaluation survey at the top of your screen that you can click on. And once we are finished with this session, after the moment of silence that we are going to do, please do join us back for the wrap-up session. So thank you once again, Sandra, Matthew, and everybody here.
And thank you so much, Sarah. And I'll go ahead with the moment of silence, but I'm going to read a poem first by Leslie McBain, who is one of the co-founders of Mom Stop the Harm. And it's called At First. Nothing makes sense. You think you won't survive. Somewhere deep down, you know the reality, but on the surface, it is unbelievable. Unbelievable. You may sense a small relief as now the worst imaginable has happened. There will be no unrelenting, deliberating worry, but then there's a guilt, a sense of relief. You sleep away at the days or you can't sleep. You question your God, your own intelligence, your memory. You may lose your appetite or the will to even drink water. You feel exhausted all the time. You feel out of control, ungrounded. Or you may wish for total control over your environment. All these things and sometimes all at once. Then you want everything back to the way it was, house clean and orderly, work bills and laundry, but you find you have a new job, obituary, funeral, condolences cards, visitors, the loved one's possessions, official business with the hospital, the coroner, the police. Grief may hide behind the door, but for a moment, grief may hide behind the door for a moment or an hour, but it never walks away. And that was written by Leslie McBain, the co-founder of Mom Stop the Harm. So, in honor of everyone that we've lost due to this poisonous crisis, this drug poisoning crisis, and the criminalization of people who use drugs, can have a moment of silence to remember and acknowledge them all. Thank you, everyone.